focus more, second here. Okay, so I focused on fish and impounded wetlands there. These were wetlands that were originally rice fields back in the 1800s and then were converted to waterfowl management structures. And basically we found that they're pretty poor in terms of habitat for fish. So I got a chance to start thinking about kind of multi-objective problems. How do we make decisions for management that affect more than one type of organism or we have more than one objective? So then I got to move to Cornell, to the New York co-op unit, where I focused mostly on decision analysis, decision science, doing projects like buck harvest, white-tailed deer buck harvest, turkey harvest management. I got to work with Drew Tyre here in Nebraska a little bit on piping clover management, so lots of different types of things. Nothing having to do with fish though. So since then, I've moved to the Michigan State University and the Quantitative Fisheries Center. So just a little bit about what the QFC does. We're a center within the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and we're focused on working with management agencies around the Great Lakes. So we have kind of 4 goals or that we work towards: building greater quantitative capacity within our fishery management agencies, improving methods for stock assessment, assisting agencies in approaches to decision making, and then developing better understanding of fish community and population dynamics, mostly focused on the Great Lakes themselves. So I wanted to start with a little bit of an introduction into the Great Lakes and fisheries management in the Great Lakes before talking about the decision problems that I'm focused on, because it's pretty complex. So the Great Lakes, as you can see here, are managed by multiple different agencies that have jurisdictional authority on some part of each lake. And we have 8 states, the province of Ontario, 2 federal governments, and a couple of different Native American resource authorities that have jurisdiction for making decisions for fisheries management. So it's pretty complex and complicated. So what we have is this entity called the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and that facilitates a process known as the Joint Strategic Plan process that allows for these different agencies to work together. It forms these different committees that you see on this left-hand side of the slide that are devoted to making decisions for each of these different lakes. So there's a working towards consensus for these different decisions, but it still requires a lot of work to get all these pieces and people working together for these decisions. So that's kind of the backdrop of the work that I'm doing in the Great Lakes region. The other thing that makes management interesting in the Great Lakes and across the world these days is ecosystem change. So we have a lot of different types of ecosystem change occurring in the Great Lakes Basin, not too dissimilar from some of the stuff that you all are dealing with here in Nebraska. The Great Lakes are highly invaded. We have over 180 different non-native species within the Great Lakes. Some of them have been around for quite some time. Like the sea lamprey that you see here is kind of our poster child invasive species. We have newer invaders like the round goby you see at the top right, and different species of Asian carp, for which there's a lot of concern. Additionally, climate change, of course, is affecting the Great Lakes in a number of different ways. This series of graphs that I'm showing you here is the lake surface temperature for each of our Great Lakes from the 1950s to present. So you can see for a lot of these lakes, we've been experiencing warmer lake surface temperatures already, and there's concern that this is going to continue to increase and cause problems or consternation for managing our fisheries. And then finally, when we're thinking about ecosystem change in the Great Lakes Basin, we also think about things like habitat fragmentation and landscape and land use change. And one way that occurs is through barriers to tributaries around the Great Lakes. We have a lot of barriers on all of our tributaries, and they can, block fish from moving upstream. They cause differences in sedimentation dynamics, and they're generally kind of poor for habitat, of course. And so there's lots of decisions to be made about how to remove these and deal with these barriers. Kevin, did you say it was okay to take this mask off while I'm talking? Sorry, I was trying to get out of breath wearing this mask. In my lab, what we focus on really are 3 different questions related to these kinds of changes that we're seeing in the Great Lakes. The first is, how do these ecosystem changes affect the fish that we have in our Great Lakes Basin? The second is, how can we make the decisions that can account for ecosystem change, as well as other types of values and objectives that we might have? And finally, how can we account for uncertainty both around the ways that these ecosystem changes might occur, as well as uncertainties we just have in terms of fisheries management and population dynamics? So the way that I've been focused on that largely in recent years is through the lens of structured decision making. So structured decision making is a framework to help us to work, coherently through a problem. Keeney calls it a formal application of common sense for situations too complex for the informal use of common sense. So we're not, rewriting history or anything. This is something that's pretty easy to think about intuitively, but it takes a while to apply. So we walk through this series of steps here that you see on the slide, starting with identifying the problem. So what is the decision that needs to be made? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the decision makers? What's the spatial scale, the temporal scale, the scope, complexity, all those things that go into understanding the frame of that problem. We then talk about the objectives next, which is basically what do we value? What do we want to achieve to solve this problem? Only after we've identified the objectives do we start thinking about the actions. What are the alternatives or actions that we could apply that would help us to achieve those different objectives that we have? In the consequences step, then, we start to think about what are the consequences of each action on each objective. And that's where we get into things like simulation modeling or data analysis, expert elicitation, use of indigenous knowledge, all these different ways to just make predictions about what we expect to see in the future with these different actions. And then we get to the trade-off step, where we often find that there isn't one action that best achieves every objective that we have. So how do we make those trade-offs, understanding now the things that we've predicted, and then we can decide and take action. And you can see that the arrows do go both ways because you can always go back if new things come up. So a couple of key components of SDM that I think are really useful for natural resources decision making. The first is that it is values focused. So we're focusing directly on our objectives and trying to use those to drive the analysis. What are the things that can help us to maximize those objectives? And it's kind of in contrast to the way that we usually think about decision making in our own lives. Probably you have a problem, you jump straight to the actions or alternatives. The second thing is that it is problem decomposition. So it's like when I'm teaching this in class, I talk about breaking it down like learning tennis or basketball. You're breaking a problem down into component parts. You're trying to complete those relevant analyses and then recompose it to make that decision. So in the context of these questions that we're working on in my lab, I thought I'd show you first kind of how they fit into the structured decision-making framework. Not everything not every product from my lab is a decision, but all the things that we do in my lab can lead to decisions. So when we're thinking about this first question of just ecosystem change and its effects on the fish, it might be the problem itself. We might be seeing the ecosystem changes occurring, which might trigger us and need to make some decisions. Or it may be the consequences step where we have to think about how do these ecosystem changes influence the predictions that we might make about the future. When we're thinking about the second question, of course, that's really just the crux of our decision-making process. And then when we're thinking about uncertainty, that might fall a different couple of places too. In the consequences step, we need to consider how does uncertainty affect the decision we might make through things like sensitivity analysis. But we may get to the end and find that there's uncertainties that might affect the decision to the point where we need to think about adaptive management and trying to iteratively make decisions to reduce those uncertainties. So I'm going to talk today about a couple of case studies that have been ongoing in my lab that kind of explain kind of how SDM works and how we've been using this in the Great Lakes Basin. The first is a case study about control of invasive grass carp in Lake Erie. I know grass carp are not only a problem in the Great Lakes, of course, we have plenty of them here. In the Great Lakes in particular, there was really a fragmented response that was occurring for grass carp. Not much collaboration happening. Of course, a lot of uncertainty about the fish themselves in the system. So we applied SDM and we're kind of working in an adaptive management framework now. In terms of the second case study, I'll talk about using decision analysis for barrier removals. Ultimately, there's a lot of trade-offs in the Great Lakes related to connectivity for both migratory fishes and invasive species. It's not ideal to just opportunistically remove these barriers for a number of reasons. So we're thinking about ways to integrate tools that can help us to lead to more structured responses for barrier removals. Focusing first on grass carp, I wanted to highlight a few of the folks that I've been working with. 3 different postdocs that have now moved on to agency positions around the Great Lakes, a colleague at the QFC and a couple of colleagues at Michigan DNR. And so before I talk about grass carp, though, I wanted to point out that I really feel like this is a good framework for thinking about collaborative responses to invasive species, whether they're in the Great Lakes or in other systems. And this is important for a number of reasons. The first is that we do have a lot of uncertainty when we're thinking about invasive species in terms of the ecology and demographics of the species in a new environment, the uncertainty about the effects of that species on our ecosystems, and the uncertainty about the effectiveness of our control strategies. We also need a lot of coordination for response activities as well as data collection and research. And in the Great Lakes in particular, we have a lot of multi-jurisdictional complexity, but other places have to deal with that in certain ways as well. So thinking specifically about grass carp, most of you have probably heard about the Asian carps before. There are 4 species. Grass carp is one of them. I'm showing you silver carp here in the picture that are kind of the more charismatic of the carps jumping out of the water. The only one we have currently in the Great Lakes is grass carp. That's the green dots on this map that I'm showing you. But you can see from all these other colors that they're all pretty close to invading the Great Lakes. There's a lot of concern in the Great Lakes in particular for a number of reasons. The first is that each of these species kind of occupies a different part of the food web. So with each of these species entering the Great Lakes, there's concerns for the ways that the food web may be changed. Similarly, they all have different effects on the ecosystem. Grass carp, for instance, as their name suggests, consume a lot of vegetation, which can remove habitat for other species of fish or for waterfowl and things like that. And then importantly, the commercial and recreational fishing industry in the Great Lakes is valued at over $7 billion per year. So anything that would influence negatively that fishing industry is quite concerning for a number of people. So additionally, grass carp, of course, aren't a new invader to the Great Lakes. They were introduced purposefully in the 60s for biocontrol for aquatic vegetation. They're actually promoted by state and federal agencies for a while as non-chemical alternatives. And you can see from kind of this before and after picture of putting grass carp in a pond that they're really effective at getting that vegetation out. But you can imagine how that might affect a native ecosystem negatively. In the Great Lakes in particular, these fish are either completely illegal to possess and produce, or they must be triploid in order to be stocked in lakes and ponds so that they're sterile. If they get out into the wild, they can't reproduce. And you can see, of course, just from 2017, all of the different existence or different places that grass carp exist. But in Lake Erie as well, they're also not new. They were first captured in the 80s, and they've been increasing in frequency of capture through time. But as I mentioned, they needed to be triploid or they weren't allowed to be there. So there was an assumption that each of these fish that are catching was triploid. They're not reproducing. It's not that big of a deal. But we do have recent evidence that they are actually successfully reproducing and recruiting in the western basin of Lake Erie. So obviously that kind of changed the game in terms of concern for this species. But it led to a lot of concern for a number of reasons. For one thing, there was a lot of uncertainty about what's going on with grass carp. We don't know a lot about grass carp biology, particularly in the Great Lakes, and we don't know how effective our control strategies are at removing the species or controlling it to acceptable levels. So that led us to apply structured decision-making to this process. So the Michigan DNR approached us at the QFC to work through a series of workshops with different managers and biologists from the agencies around Lake Erie, as well as agencies that have experience with Asian carp management, and some researchers from some different universities. And so we ran 3 two-day structured decision-making workshops over the course of about a year and a half with this group to walk through this series of steps. So I'm going to kind of tell you and walk through how we worked through this problem together just for a few minutes. So the first step then, I think this is stopped working now. Well, I can tell you the first step. We're just talking about these issues with computers. This one's not working anymore. There we go. Okay. The first step is to clarify the decision context and try to figure out what the problem is. So a lot of natural resources kind of issues around decisions revolve around not clearly defining the problem. You get to the end and you realize we weren't all on the same page about what the problem was in the first place. But our context is pretty much what I've already told you. They're reproducing. We know that their ecosystem engineers are changing that environment. They pose a threat to different aspects of the ecosystem as well as our resource users. We need to have some cooperation among these different jurisdictions that have management authority. And we know that actions we might take could also affect different stakeholder groups negatively. So ultimately, the decision was to develop a strategy for controlling grass carp in Lake Erie to socially and environmentally acceptable levels. And that acceptable levels piece is important because even though people might want to eradicate completely grass carp from Lake Erie, it's a large lake, and that's a lot to ask. So can we think about what the acceptable amount of grass carp might be? So then we got to the objectives phase, that second phase, where we found that really the objectives revolved around a few different things: ecological, economic, and kind of social objectives. One ecological objective was just to minimize the grass carp population by minimizing the risk of spread and the abundance both within Lake Erie and the Great Lakes, and then minimizing the effects on the ecosystem, largely in terms of negative effects on vegetation. Economically, it really came down to minimizing the costs for these actions, not because they didn't want to spend money on it, but because a dollar spent on grass carp is a dollar not used for other aspects of management around the Great Lakes. And then on the social side, as well as some ecosystem side, we had an objective related to minimizing collateral damage. We knew that some of the actions that we could take could negatively affect other parts of the ecosystem. We wanted to avoid economic stress to different stakeholders, recreational and commercial fishers or boaters, or things like that, and avoid negative effects on native ecosystems like migratory fish or threatened and endangered species. And then finally, we wanted to maintain the public sentiment to be able to apply these actions. We need that social license to be able to do the things that we felt were necessary to control the population. So, armed with our objectives, we asked the group to identify the alternatives that they thought might help us to achieve our objectives, largely related to the grass carp themselves. And they were really creative. They had like 25 or 30 different actions that they came up with that could help with the grass carp issue. And these actions really revolved around things like removing fish by adding added fishing mortality to the system, reducing recruitment by keeping the fish from moving upstream to spawn or things like that, and then just eliminating any remaining inputs into the system. But what we found, importantly, is that there's a lot of uncertainty about how effective these strategies might be and what the timeline might be for implementation. Some of these things were like years out from being developed and actually implemented. So what we decided to do for this round was to focus on uncertainty. How effective do we need to be to control these fish to the levels that we want to control them to? What are the key uncertainties that might keep us from being able to achieve our objectives? So we decided to focus on 4 different scenarios. These are kind of hypothetical scenarios that ranged from doing nothing to putting a lot of effort in to see how that affected the population. The first scenario was to do nothing, and that's not what was happening in the grass carp world, but it gave us a baseline what we expected the fish population to do if we were just to leave it alone. The second scenario was what we call distributed removal. So we were just trying to remove fish across seasons and habitats based on kind of what we know. We've caught fish here before. We should go back here and catch some more. The third was a more concentrated removal effort where we might try to focus our efforts on seasons and areas with higher catchability. We know that we can catch more fish, for instance, when they're spawning in the Sandusky River. Maybe we should just focus on that. And then the fourth scenario was to pair number 3 with some sort of barrier that would block the fish from moving upstream. So they require kind of long stretches of high flowing rivers to spawn, and the Sandusky River provides great spawning habitat. So if we could block them from moving upstream, maybe that would help with the situation as well. And so the next step then is to predict the consequences. So we had a lot of different objectives to consider. We used a few different techniques for the consequences step. For the grass carp themselves, we created a population model that I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute about, just to predict forward in time how many fish would we expect to see under those different scenarios. For the vegetation consumption, we took the output from that population model and put it into an existing bioenergetics model that allowed us to kind of predict how much vegetation we would expect to be consumed by that number of grass carp. And we used some expert elicitation to understand what's kind of the threshold amount of consumption before we see habitat degradation. And then finally, for costs and for things like threatened and endangered species like this mussel, we had to use expert elicitation because there wasn't really any data available to help us to predict what actions that we could implement might do to these different species or to our stakeholders. So I'm not going to talk about all of this today because of time constraints, but I'll give you a little bit of an example with the population model. So we created a matrix model that focused on 3 different regions of the system. So you're looking at the western basin of Lake Erie here. And we focused on the 3 rivers, the River Raisin, the Maumee, and the Sandusky River. And we looked at both, or we focused on two different habitats, the rivers themselves, and then kind of the nearshore habitat where we thought that they would be feeding outside the mouths of the rivers, kind of these green areas where there's lots of vegetation, and then 4 seasons. And this matrix model allowed us to project forward in time the abundance of fish at each age throughout time through about 50 years under these different actions that we could implement. And then we used data from Lake Erie where available, but we just really didn't have much data yet from Lake Erie. So we used a lot of data from the native range and kind of made our best guess in some instances to what was going on. And we incorporated our uncertainty through different probabilistic distributions. So the goal of this model then was to evaluate our spatially and temporally specific response actions to see how they would influence our population. And so just a little bit of the outcomes from this. What I'm showing you here is the density of fish per hectare under these 4 different scenarios after 25 and 50 years. And so we had a target density of 10 fish per hectare or fewer. This came out of some risk assessment work that was conducted that said that basically that's kind of the tipping point for this is too many fish in the system. But what you can see from this graph is that after 50 years, really the only action that was still largely keeping the fish population below this threshold was the one that required the most effort, removing lots of fish and putting up a barrier to keep them from reproducing. So we knew we needed to be pretty effective to achieve that objective related to the population. So I'm not going to get into the other objectives right now. I'm happy to talk about them later. What I wanted to talk about briefly, though, is the trade-offs. So this is a step where we put everything together, all of our predictions from our different objectives, and we asked our working group, which is largely agency biologists and managers, to put some weight on these different objectives based on the outcomes of those predictions. And they ended up placing about half the weight on the population objective, and then split the other half between costs and collateral damage. And so each of these bars is showing you what's called an expected utility value for each of these scenarios. The longer the bar, the greater the expected utility value, the better that option is. The utility value is made up of the weighted consequence for each of those objectives. So each color represents a different objective. The browns are the risk of spread and vegetation loss. We've got cost and the tan color, and then so on with these different objectives identified down at the bottom. So what you can see is that the barrier and removal scenario was best, as we expected, because it's the most effort. We can really achieve our population objectives with these 2 brown bars, and we're getting good public sentiment because we're doing something. But what we found was really interesting was that actually doing nothing came out second. And that's because even though it wasn't doing anything towards the grass carp population, we weren't spending money, and we weren't causing any collateral damage on any part of the ecosystem or the social side. Whereas these other 2 did those things, and they didn't achieve the objectives related to the population. So this really was kind of a good take home for the group to realize that they had to be pretty effective in order to make it worth it to really work towards this grass carp response strategy. So some of the outputs from this particular case study was first that there were key uncertainties that affect our decision. We don't know a lot about the demography of the fish in the Great Lakes. We didn't know a lot about how they are moving seasonally around the lake. Gear effectiveness was a big question, both in terms of type and season and habitat. Population size is still an open question in the Great Lakes. And then, of course, funding and effort is always kind of an uncertainty as you're moving forward. So some of the takeaways are really that this was really integral for coordination for these 4 states and 1 province and 2 countries that have jurisdiction in Lake Erie. So it's quite helpful, but we found that we need to move really into an adaptive management strategy to reduce some of these uncertainties. And we're focusing first on gear effectiveness, because what we found is that we have to achieve a certain amount of effectiveness to remove enough fish to make it worth it to conduct these response strategies. So not knowing how effective our gear are means that we don't know how much effort we have to put into it. And we even have enough hours in the day to put towards that gear application. And so we're moving into an adaptive phase slowly. We received some money from the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program to start to think about when and where we should sample, how we should sample, and kind of compare different gear that are applied with this grass carp work currently. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but really what we did was we were able to sample 3 sites located here in the Michigan waters of Lake Erie monthly for 2 years with a couple of different types of gears that were quite common. And we were trying to get towards catchability, but we couldn't quite get there. We used an occupancy modeling framework to evaluate detection probability of these two different gears. And we did focus on some surrogate species, common carp and buffalo, because they were much more common than grass carp. I think we caught one grass carp during the study. But what we found was that these gears that we were applying really were pretty equal in Michigan waters for detection of these different species. But I wanted to highlight again that multi-jurisdictional part, because we were able to partner with Fisheries and Oceans Canada and their Asian carp monitoring program, where they were applying the same gear, catching the same species, to go from 3 to 26 sites. And with that added resolution, we actually found that one gear, applying a trammel net and electrofishing around it, was much more effective than the other gear in terms of detection probability, at least. Again, not catchability, but it's a step along the way to better understanding the effectiveness for these gears. A couple of other things I wanted to highlight from applying decision analysis to this problem was, first, again, the coordination. We have a unified calendar, coordinated efforts for response activities among all the agencies and researchers. We basically just wrote on a whiteboard what everybody did every month of the summer for grass carp, and that kind of led them to work together more to make a coordinated response plan. We also have 5-year management plans now for Michigan and Ohio DNRs for grass carp, and a 5-year adaptive response strategy for the Lake Erie Committee. We're about halfway through these now, and we're working towards trying to reevaluate some of what's going on based on what we said in that response strategy. We also, our working group that we had pulled together for this process is now formally the Grass Carp Advisory Committee. So we have a committee within the Great Lakes Fishery Commission structure devoted just to grass carp. And then we have this predictive model that I described, and we're actually working to update that now. As I said, there was a lot of uncertainty. There still is a lot of uncertainty, but we've got 5 years more data and research that have happened. So we're updating it with things like acoustic telemetry information from grass carp tagging studies and some information from a barrier feasibility study that's about to be completed. So I've got a new postdoc that's working to update that now so we can continue to evaluate these strategies as they come forward. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about barriers. Also a little bit about invasive species though. So this is some work that I've been conducting with a few different students and postdocs. With this work, I'll talk about some work that my postdoc Shin Young Lin worked on, as well as my current PhD student Shane Flynn. Working to try to incorporate ecological and social science into decisions for barrier removals. So we have a lot of barriers in the Great Lakes. As I said before, they're not great. You know, they block fish passage, they hold back sediments, might hold back contaminants as well. Why don't we just get rid of them? And the short answer for a lot of these barriers in the Great Lakes is sea lamprey. The sea lamprey are an invader that have been around for quite some time. So they first invaded the upper Great Lakes in the mid-1900s. And this is the first invasion in Lake Superior. And subsequently, we saw a huge decline in lake trout harvest across the Great Lakes. There was some overfishing happening with commercial fishing, but a lot of that decline has been attributed to lake trout being preyed upon by a sea lamprey. This is a mark that's left behind after a sea lamprey attack. Lake trout appear to be kind of the preferred food for sea lamprey in the system. So there was a lot of concern, of course, and actually led to the formation of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. But we found that we can be effective at controlling the species by using a number of methods. The first is that we have barriers already in the system, and some have been built that block sea lamprey from moving upstream to spawn, so we can kind of keep them from reproducing. The other way is through lampricide, which is a chemical that's put into the streams after they spawn to kill the larvae. So what I'm showing you here, I keep turning around so I'm right behind me, but this series of graphs is showing for 3 different lakes some recent work that we did to try to hindcast what the population size of sea lamprey likely was before the implementation of control strategies. So this dotted line onto these is the increase in control through barriers or through lampricide. And so each of these lines represents kind of a different trapping efficiency. We're using kind of historic trapping data. But what you can see is that we're really effective now at controlling sea lamprey. They're at a fraction of the abundance that they were back when they invaded. So of course, there's a lot of concern anything that might affect that effectiveness of control strategies. So when we think about barriers, we know they're important for causing connectivity loss and habitat fragmentation. Lots of folks are focused on thinking about how we can remove or remediate these barriers, but we do have trade-offs, and namely in terms of connectivity for migratory fishes and increased habitat for invasive sea lamprey. Every barrier that's removed is more money and more land per side that has to be put out every year. But we have other trade-offs too that don't get talked about as frequently. Some of you probably have thought about as well in your work. It is costly to either remove or to maintain a barrier. There's issues with public safety. Some of these are aging. There's concerns about degradation of these barriers. Some people just like to fish around them. They create different types of habitat for angling. Some people just want to preserve them as historic structures in some instances. And then there's some kind of NIMBYism, not in my backyard. Don't remove this barrier because we'll end up with more kayakers and fishers in my stretch of the stream. So lots of different things to consider. When I first started at Michigan State, I received some funding from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission to start thinking about barrier removal prioritization. This is kind of a goal for GLFC, who controls sea lamprey, to understand how we can better prioritize which barriers get removed so that there's not kind of this shotgun approach to barrier removal. So we wanted to look at specifically decision support tools. So there are a lot of online decision support tools that exist that people can use to think about barrier removal prioritization. There's a suite of tools that could be useful for understanding kind of how many river kilometers are opened up when a barrier is removed, and can prioritize based on that. Others might optimize on the sedimentation changes that you might gain from barrier removals. And so what Shin-Young, my postdoc, was working on was kind of which of these tools is best? Will managers actually use them? And is there actually more value in having lots of local on-the-ground information versus just using a tool to make these prioritizations? We collaborated with this Michigan Tribal Stream and Fruit Belt Collaborative because they do have that on-the-ground information, so we could kind of compare the tools to what they were actually doing. So short answer is that really the tools aren't one size fits all because each tool does a different thing. It depends on what you want out of that tool. Local data could be better in some instances, but ultimately values are important, and we're not capturing all of them by using a decision support tool. So we need to get that stakeholder input to make better decisions for barrier prioritization and removal. As far as the one size fits all piece, Shin-Young kind of put together this map where if you have an objective for, say, reducing sedimentation, there's certain tools that might be better, whereas restoring connectivity would lead you to a whole different set of tools. Thinking about climate change would change things as well. So lots of different ways that you might think about which tool is best, but they're still not capturing all of those objectives. And thinking about just the trade-offs section. So what we did was simulate using one of the tools, a number of different scenarios that you might be thinking about for barrier removal. What's the different climate future? What kind of fishery do we care about? Warm water or cold water fish? Just different aspects of the habitat. And what I'm showing you on the left-hand side here is from this lower portion of Western Michigan, all the barriers that were chosen for 13 different scenarios. The darker the dot, the more often that barrier was chosen in a prioritization scheme. And you can see a lot of those dots are chosen over and over again with these scenarios. So like climate change and types of fish weren't as important as this 14th scenario where we said you cannot remove a barrier that blocks sea lamprey. This was the big one where we found, we actually were removing a lot more smaller barriers that were less costly and weren't really getting you much bang for your buck, but they weren't allowing sea lamprey to invade. So there is a trade-off there with these different objectives. And so we were thinking more about kind of what is it about barrier removals that makes it difficult? It comes down to this idea of scale mismatches. So we thought about scale in a number of ways. The first is the spatial scale. So we're kind of failing at times to consider ecological and social effects beyond that local scale of where the barrier is removed. We might not think about how the barrier removal might influence the lake-wide population of a particular fish, or we might not consider stakeholder needs upstream or downstream of that barrier. On the temporal side, we don't usually have a lot of pre-removal assessment or post-removal monitoring plans in place, certainly not long-term monitoring after the removal. And we saw this thing called contrasting expectations that are based on differing time horizons. And basically, different people are thinking about different time scales. Some people, when they think about barrier removals, they're thinking about the outcomes just after barrier removal. It looks pretty bad. You're not really getting a lot of good habitat for fish, but other people might be considering a few years down the line. These are the same place with a few years in between. So not having that same time scale in your mind really makes it difficult to make decisions as a group. And then on the functional scale, this is really common. We see that the scope, the objectives, the actions are often focused on kind of institutional interests. We're failing to consider that full scope of social and ecological concerns, which can make it more difficult to make decisions that are palatable to all people. So you'll be surprised to note that we suggest that structured decision making is a better way to think about these barrier removal decisions in some instances and overcome these mismatches in scale. On the spatial side, we can use SDM to, in the problem and objectives phase, define the geographic and socio-ecological scales that are relevant for this problem. We can, on the temporal side, be explicit about defining our objectives and measures and the time scale for those measures. Use participatory modeling in the consequences step. Really consider the temporal dynamics when we're thinking about the models, as well as how we're monitoring coast removal, and make sure that we're including all the stakeholders. And then on the functional side, this is throughout the process. We can do things like include ecologists and social scientists throughout. We can consider broader spatial and socio-ecological scales. We can use participatory modeling and those decision support tools that I described within that consequences step as part of a larger piece of the puzzle. So I'm going to talk just for a minute about a case study that we've been working on, that my PhD student Shane has been working on for a couple of years now, related to experimental selective fish passage. So the Great Lakes Fishery Commission has a new project that they call Fish Pass, which is a barrier that's going to be going in on the Boardman River in Traverse City in Michigan. Fish Pass is basically just that, an experimental selective fish passage facility. We want to replace the current barrier that's blocking sea lamprey with an experimental facility where we can try to figure out how we can selectively pass desirable fish while blocking undesirable fish. And of course, this is largely related to sea lamprey. But beyond that, it's kind of an open question. What do we think is a desirable fish? As I mentioned, we have lots of non-native species. So are some of these salmonins, the Pacific salmonins, worth passing? Do we want to block those? Who gets to make those decisions? And then once we decide that, can we actually achieve desired fish production in the river for these species? And finally, what are the social and economic effects of fish passage? So Shane and I have been running a series of structured decision-making workshops with a group of stakeholders around the Boardman. I don't want you to read all of this, but we got to the point where we've identified the objectives that this group came up with related to fish passage just on the Boardman River. It's been a slow process because it's all been virtual, which is nobody's favorite thing to do these days. But what we came up with was basically two overarching kind of fundamental objectives in green. First, at the top is maximizing the integrity and ecological health of the river, and at the bottom, maximizing user and public satisfaction. You can see all the things that were means objectives to that. And really, there were multiple values that were articulated within each of these fundamental objectives. On the ecological side, of course, invasive species were a concern, but also enhancing connectivity, having a sustainable fish community, and avoiding negative human impacts that they thought might occur from increased tourism if certain fish were passed. On the satisfaction side, we identified a number of different angling groups that could be affected by decisions for fish passage, and each of these groups have different species preferences. In addition, of course, public safety came up, and landowner property value and quality of life. So lots of different things when we just consider what fish gets past a barrier on one river. So what Shane is doing now is starting to think about the prediction part of this. How do we predict the consequences of passing different species of fish? How does that influence riverine populations and Great Lakes populations? We started a couple of years ago with some simple simulation models where we created a model to try to understand how does the barrier removal affect just the lake-wide population of a particular species. And we evaluated different species that have different tendencies to stray from their natal range and also to home back for spawning. And so we did see some differences in how these different species would be affected by barrier removal, just depending on how much they move and whether they come back to spawn in the same place. So Shane is now working on an individual-based model approach to understand for each species that the stakeholders identified as important, how does that influence their population, both in the river and in the Great Lakes. So this is kind of an ongoing process right now. So that's kind of the end of the story for now, but hopefully I'll have a little more data in a few years with the modeling part. But ultimately, barrier removal and prioritization decisions are difficult. And they're difficult for a number of reasons. We have a lot of objectives, more than a simple decision support tool can account for. We have a lot of strongly opinionated stakeholders in the region that have different opinions about what they want. And there is uncertainty for effective removal, fish passage on fish populations. But if we can integrate the tools and the modeling approaches we have into an SDM framework, we can do a better job of making these decisions more tractable. So hopefully I'll have some more information to give you guys a little farther down the line. One of the last things I wanted to end with is that you may have seen some kind of common threads with these decision problems. Our objectives tend to focus around three different kind of categories: population and community dynamics, costs, whether that's money or time or opportunity costs, and user or public satisfaction. That could be anglers or hunters or other stakeholders. We often, in the consequences step, have some sort of explicit model that helps us to predict the outcomes. And uncertainty is everywhere when we're thinking about our decisions in natural resources management. So we have to figure out what uncertainties actually matter for the decision, which ones would change the decision that we would make. And so one of the last things to talk about before I finish up is this idea of stakeholder satisfaction. Who should be included in these satisfactions when we're talking about stakeholder satisfaction? One of the things that is interesting about decision analysis for natural resources is it's kind of been pushed forward by ecologists. We're really good at facilitating these processes. We're great at building ecological models to make predictions, but we've kind of lagged behind on the integration of social science into decision analysis. We don't spend as much time thinking about making predictions for some of these kind of more social objectives. So we wrote a paper, I and some of my colleagues from Cornell when I was at the New York Co-op unit, thinking about how we might be able to better integrate social science into decision analysis. We know that different people will frame the problem differently or have different things that they value and find acceptable. We need to figure out kind of if participation is necessary and predict if they'll actually do what they say they will do. We know that different stakeholders will benefit or have consequence to certain actions. And then we need to have some kind of outreach and education potentially after we make those decisions. So lots of places where social science could play a better role or a bigger role in decision analysis. And that's an ongoing thing. I don't have like a magic bullet for that, but it's something that we need to work towards. And the other thing is that we need to really think about improving diversity of stakeholders and rights holders at the table when we're making these decisions. Within the Great Lakes region, we have a rich history of tribes and First Nations around the region that have decision-making authority for fisheries and wildlife resources through the treaties and consultation and government consultation that has to occur. But we argue that tribal and First Nations members can act like stakeholders of their indigenous governments and be part of the process in that way. And we also need to think more about how we can integrate indigenous knowledge into these decision-making processes. I was telling someone earlier today, I feel like I always say we can use indigenous knowledge as part of our consequences step, but it's not really done very often. So how can we do that better? Some of the stuff that we've been working on at the QFC, I've got a project where I've been working with First Nations and Métis Nation in Ontario through structured decision-making workshops for walleye harvest management and salmonid stocking. The Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians is part of our fish pass work. And we're slowly having discussions about how we could use some indigenous knowledge, not only in that process, but in inland fisheries management. And I've got a couple of proposals in that hopefully will be funded to work on SDM work related to wetland restoration and management of wild rice or monomen with the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians in Michigan. So there's some movement forward, not only by me, but by folks around the Great Lakes region to think about how we can bring tribes and First Nations into these decision-making processes. But we also need to think about other stakeholders too. What I often find is that we have anglers and hunters at the table for these processes, but other people likely should be included or at least are affected by decisions that we make. I teach a grad class every other spring on structured decision making and natural resources management. And this came up a lot this past time that I taught it in the spring of 2021. And so what we decided to do was just kind of think about what are the challenges and some of the solutions to bringing in other stakeholders besides the user groups that are typically involved. Some of the challenges that the class identified were things like power inequalities among these different groups, the lack of the knowledge potentially of the decision makers about who these stakeholders are, potentially legacy effects of having been excluded in the past from these decisions, and then potentially also a lack of or erosion of trust. But they came up with some interesting solutions that we can work towards, things like having diversity and inclusion as a process objective in our decision-making processes. As the decision maker, working to increase the network and make better connections among these different groups. As a facilitator, we could try to be a change agent, trying to push for more inclusion in these processes. but ultimately having increased funding to reduce barriers to integration of these different groups into participation is important. And then just working to build trust. They gave an example of Deb Holland, our Secretary of the Department of Interior, is a member of a Native American tribe, and just having that representation there can help to build trust with some of these agencies. So again, don't have an answer for this now. This is some of the stuff that I've been thinking about in the last couple of years at Michigan State. So I will stop there. I'm happy to take any questions that you have, and I've got my contact information down there as well. Thanks.
First of all, Kelly, thank you for a fascinating presentation. We have time for questions.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. And I think the pieces that you covered towards the end were absolutely the things that I was like, yeah, really, really important. And so that was a big question of mine, is in structured decision making, like the idea that there will be an answer that rises to the top that everybody agrees on is sort of, it seems like the big assumption. And
Yeah.
so I thought it was interesting. I would love to learn more about how you did the economic cost and benefit, and who put the value, and you know how those things were weighted, and you know, and what happens if the solution of of doing something and the solution of not doing something maybe actually came out to be the exact same length bars, but with different costs and benefits. I think so. I think the work that you're doing is really interesting and clearly very complex.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I think, often we call it structured decision making, but we kind of tend when we work with these groups to say this is decision aiding. We're aiding you in making these decisions because, sometimes it does come out like this is the best choice. You should definitely do this. Let's just move on. But there are, and I think as you start to think about who is involved in these processes, there's more consideration of how you do weight those objectives. How are these things considered? How are we making these decisions in terms of our predictive modeling and what data went into it? Sorry, I'm kind of rambling now because it's been a long day. But ultimately, there is a decision maker, and that person has to understand the different parts of the process. What are the things that are going into their decision? What do the stakeholders value? Maybe there's not a best answer, but they can at least have that information and see how they need to value those different pieces of information. I think it's important when we work with stakeholders, whether they're biologists in an agency or whether they're truly the general public, that they understand that too, that they're not, the stakeholders are making the decision, but they're providing that information for a decision maker to make that decision. That doesn't let us off the hook for making sure that we give them as much information and something that's coherent to make that decision. But yeah, it's difficult I do think as we start to involve more people, there's going to be more discussion that needs to happen rather than just a single best answer.
Other questions?
With the grass carp in Lake Erie, why are most of them not known for their ploidy?
Why? I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Why are the grass carp in Lake Erie, like, I noticed that the majority of them were unknown in their ploidy?
Oh, yeah, right. So up until recently, they hadn't been testing the ploidy of them. Since we started kind of doing a more coordinated approach to everything, they are testing the ploidy of all the fish. But yeah, like a lot of them were caught back when they just didn't take the time to assess that. Maybe they just thought they were triploid. But now they collect, I think they use eyeballs now they send it to the Fish and Wildlife Service to check the ploidy of all the fish. We are still seeing like a lot of triploid fish that we're catching that we think are coming out of some specific areas, but also a lot of diploids. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, okay.
So lots of different, well, first, I always love, you do a great job with these case studies, and it's just really cool to see how the groups work through things. And I agree with Tanya that the results as you present them are really interesting to think about. There a lot of times we find ourselves in different circumstances for decisions, and so we always play these games, but like if time is limited and you can't go through the whole Kelly Robinson facilitated 3-year, 3 meeting,
Sure.
whatever thing, just from your interaction with people during these facilitation processes, is there like 1 or 2 of those steps that seem to be like more important than some of the others in kind of people saying, oh, wow, that was really useful to go
Yeah,
through that step
right.
rather than, the whole shoot match?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that front end, like getting the problem and the objectives identified is sometimes you do that and people are like, oh, okay, yeah, I know the answer to the question. Sometimes you need the whole thing. Keeney has this great, I have this set of arrows on a figure that it's like, say you're making 10,000 decisions, probably 9,000 of them don't need even like half the process, and certainly only a few and end up going through the entire process. But I think people just don't spend enough time kind of thinking about the problem to begin with. I know I don't in my own life in a lot of ways too, but yeah, so I think, I mean, ultimately, like having the data and having the models, if you have them, is great and quite helpful, but just giving some thought to what the objectives are that you're trying to achieve can sometimes provide you with a better answer with a short amount of time than just like picking something without thinking hard about this problem and objectives, I think, yeah.
Kelly, I was fascinated by the no action having the highest or second highest utility value.
Yeah,
And from previous conversations, clearly the group there took that as a charge that they had to really dig in and do well. How's that being received by folks outside of that group? I mean, to me, I could see all of a sudden this is a message for folks that want to derail things,
yeah.
that doing nothing is better in many cases than a lot of the other things we could do.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if like they're kind of, so other than writing it in a paper and kind of having some presentations about it, I haven't like done I'm not in charge of how they present it. And I'm not sure that these agencies are really saying, oh, hey, one of the biggest things was that maybe we should just not do anything. So I haven't heard of a lot of pushback. I don't think that there's as much concern with something like grass carp or Asian carp as there is for some other kinds of issues in the Great Lakes. I think most people are kind of on the same page that we need to do something about this invasive species. Maybe they've seen enough videos of like silver carp, hitting people when they're boating that they're not as concerned about that. I'm certain there are people that probably have gotten wind of this and have had that reaction, but I haven't heard about that much of it.
John, do we have some virtual questions? We do not. Wake up out there.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I have kind of 2 questions and I'll kind of space them out instead of just going all at once. But the first question I had was, for the expected utility values, is that pretty helpful in facilitating the conversation about the different actions you could take amongst the multi-jurisdictional agencies at the table?
Yeah, I think it's helpful for them. We kind of try to present things different ways, right? Because different people think about things differently or need different ways to visualize stuff. But I think that's really helpful for them to kind of see. And we also can sometimes play games with how we weight those different objectives. How would that change, the utility value for this particular action or this other action? So yeah, I think that's pretty helpful for them to see. Sometimes that isn't the ultimate decision, there's still some discussions that happen or changes in weights. But yeah, I think having that visual of kind of this is what these decisions would result in is helpful.
And then second question really quickly is, like I know that when making a decision, the more people at the table, it can be hard actually like kind of coming to a conclusion where everyone's kind of happy, I guess. Do you find that in your work, like, I guess, can you speak a little bit to maybe like satisfaction for all groups and how you kind of perceive that throughout your work?
Yeah, so I will kind of preface this by saying some of the stuff, I've historically been working a lot with agency people, and so this is a newer thing where we're kind of in the middle of some of these processes that I've encountered with stakeholders. I think having stakeholders kind of feeling like they're part of the process is one of the best parts of it. Like, and then kind of seeing how those trade-offs play out. So I was telling someone a story earlier about one of the projects that I'm kind of taking over, but a colleague of mine started is thinking about management of perkid fisheries in Lake Erie, so yellow perch and walleye. And it's historically been very contentious, but they decided to bring the commercial and recreational stakeholders to the table to work through the process together. I mean, at the end, they looked at the trade-offs and said, look how just a little bit of a loss of fishing for recreational fishers will really increase the output for commercial fishers. And having them all there to see that and have it work together to that point, I think the recreational fishers were a little more willing to accept that, like, fraction of a fish per hour loss, given that they had been working with this group, and it was kind of more of a trust thing in some ways at that point. It was kind of fortuitous that came out that way. It could have been really bad both ways, but yeah. So I think there's a lot of benefits to bringing people together just to feel like they're part of that process. Yeah.
So we do have one from Zoom here, and the question is from Ken Chapman. In the experimental barrier, do you have automated sensing systems, perhaps a camera, to count or analyze the fish that are passing?
Yeah, that's something that hasn't been implemented yet. So I know there's an engineering company that's been contracted to do some of the kind of on the ground work to understand how that might actually work. So likely I'm sorry, I'm thinking about the grass carp stuff. Yeah, in the experimental barrier on the Boardman River, yes, so there's lots of cameras. They have an entire raceway devoted to being able to apply experimental actions, and they'll have all kinds of different ways to evaluate what's passing and what's not actually making it through. So yeah.
I think we've hit our hour barrier. Kelly, I have a couple of swag items as a thank you.
All right, thanks.
Ken, we give Kelly another round of applause.
Thanks, everybody.
And if anyone wants to stick around and visit with Kelly, we will stick around till then. Larkin forgot to announce for students. Sign-up sheets up here, please. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I appreciate it.